Good evening, everyone. My name is Rachel Cass, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this evening's event with Sean Dorrance Kelly, co-author of the new book, All Things Shining, Reading the Western Classics to Find Meaning in a Secular Age. Professor Kelly is chair of the Department of Philosophy here at Harvard University, where he is also co-chair of the Interdisciplinary Committee for the Study of Mind, Brain, and Behavior. He has previously taught at Stanford and Princeton, and his courses at Harvard have included 20th century French and German philosophy, philosophy of the mind, imagination and memory, and philosophy of literature. His new book, co-authored with UC Berkeley philosophy professor Hubert L. Dreyfus, looks at the myriad choices that surround us in today's world and asks the question, in a secular culture, where can and do we look for guidance and meaning? In an op-ed column for the New York Times, David Brooks writes of the book, occasionally brave philosophers leap out of their professional lanes and illuminate things for the wider public. Hubert Dreyfus and Sean Dorrance Kelly take a smart, sweeping run through the history of Western philosophy, but their book is important for the way it illuminates life today and for the controversial advice it offers on how to live. After the talk tonight, we will have time for questions, followed by a signing here at the front. I'd like to take this moment to thank anyone who purchases a book here this evening. By purchasing your books at Harvard Bookstore, you're supporting a local independent bookstore as well as this author series. Now please join me in welcoming Sean Dorrance Kelly.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. I'm delighted to support. Let's see, am I doing this right? Can you hear me if I do this? Okay. I'm delighted to support a local independent bookstore too, and I'm really pleased to be here. So I've been doing a lot of these. In fact, I just took the red eye back from San Francisco last night, so I haven't slept. If I fall down, someone please catch me. But I've been doing them, so I think I know what I'm up to, but I'm going to try to do this one in a slightly different way than I've been doing them. In San Francisco, and Berkeley, I had the good fortune to do a bunch of events with my co-author, Bert Dreyfus, and that was delightful, but now I'm going to have to stand here on my own and do it, so I'll try to play both roles. Let me just tell you a little bit to begin with about the history of the book, where it came from. It really was a sort of genuinely joint effort, although the sort of center of the book comes from my co-authors from a course that he's been teaching for probably about 20 years now at UC Berkeley, where I was a graduate student and a teaching assistant for him in the course probably about 20 years ago. And the course, the way it was designed, was really just intended to go through the works of art in the history of the West that, in his view, were the sort of central works of art, the ones that had really gathered together and focused for epochs in the history of the West, their understanding of what it was to be themselves and what it was to be things outside of themselves and what it was to aspire to live the best life possible. And the sort of idea behind the course was that that there are different epochs in the history of the West, and the different epochs have very different conceptions of what it is to be our kind of being and what it is to be to aspire to be the best when you're being our kind of being. And so it was really just an attempt to go through and read these texts that manifested those understandings of human being. And it started with Homer's Odyssey, and it did Aeschylus's Oresteia, it did Virgil for a while, it did the Book of John, it did Dante, and it always ended with Melville's Moby Dick. And in teaching that course, being a teaching assistant for that course, I realized something extraordinary about the experience that I had in it and the experience that the students had in it. It was a special kind of experience because in a typical great books course, you read these books and you're sort of reading them for some universal understanding of what they've gotten right that we already understand. But the way Bert was reading these texts was sort of the opposite. He was looking for what they got right that we've forgotten. And so he was really going through looking at these very different understandings of what it is to be the best kind of being we can be, So different that if you really got yourself in the middle of them, they reoriented the way you understood your own life. And you would do it maybe 4 or 5 different times, one for each of the epochs in the history of the West. And that was pretty. I found that the students found that was a really sort of exciting experience. And so I tried to think about why that was an exciting experience. And in thinking about that, we put a kind of frame on the book. So the book has these readings of the great texts that organize understandings of human existence throughout the history of the West. But it's framed by a kind of question. And the question is something like this. The question is, what are the problems that we confront living in the epoch that we live in that are unique and different from the kinds of problems that people in earlier epochs confront? And is there anything that we can appropriate from their understanding of themselves in these earlier epochs that'll give us resources for dealing with the unique kinds of problems that we've got? So that was the frame. And the particular unique problem that we started to think about has to do with the idea, not really our idea, but an idea that we borrow from some other philosophers, especially a philosopher named Charles Taylor. The idea that the age that we live in is different from all the earlier ages in the history of the West, because ours is in some way or another a secular age. That's the name that these philosophers have given to it. And what that means, I mean, you might think that that's a funny name for our age, especially living in the United States, where, there are quite a lot of people who are not secular people. Why would you call our age a secular age? So the idea is not that our age is a secular age because there aren't any religious believers. The idea is that our age is a secular age because for religious believers and non-religious believers alike, religion doesn't play the role in our lives that it used to in earlier epochs in the history of the West. Let me give you an example of why this might be true. In the Middle Ages, if you met someone who didn't share your religious belief, then the fact that they didn't share your religious belief was sufficient to justify you in thinking that they were less than human. That's all it took. If you met someone who didn't share your religious belief, then there was no step at all between that fact and the fact that they were less than human, they were condemnable, it might be required that you burn them at the stake, and all sorts of things. That move doesn't seem to work in our epoch. I think it's a good thing that move doesn't work in our epoch. There's, in the society, I think everyone will agree, a kind of pluralistic force that makes it very difficult to assume that if you meet someone who doesn't share your religious beliefs, that for that reason alone, they're less than human. In fact, the social impetus seems to be in just the opposite direction. The social sort of pressure seems to suggest that it's quite possible that you could meet someone who doesn't share your religious beliefs, who nevertheless is living a very admirable life, right? I mean, that seems perfectly natural to most of us, this kind of pluralistic impulse. Maybe you might even think that they're living a life that's more admirable than the life that you're living. But if there's really this social pressure to recognize that possibility, then for people who have religious beliefs, those beliefs can't play the role of automatically sanctioning a certain way of life. That's to say, the role that they used to play in earlier epochs. And the analysis, which again, it was partly ours, but also partly borrowed from other philosophers, suggests that if you find yourself in a society like that, you'll be confronted with particular kinds of problems that haven't been faced in earlier epochs in the history of the West. In particular, it will be very difficult to understand on the basis of what you're supposed to aspire to the best life possible. How are you supposed to understand what the best life possible is, and on the basis of what are you supposed to understand that? That seems to be a problem, I think, that a lot of my students recognize when they're making big decisions in their lives, which students are making when they're 18 to 30. I mean, students are around for a long time now. There they are. They're there for a long time, and they're making these decisions, the big, important decisions about who they're going to be, about their identity, about what their political positions are going to be, about what their profession is going to be. Many of them seem to feel as though they have quite a lot of choice, which is a very exciting thing. But they also feel as though they don't have the resources to figure out on the basis of what they're supposed to constrain their choices. And I think if the culture becomes such that it doesn't have any resources for that, then there's a big threat that looms. It's the threat that the 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche called the threat of nihilism. Nietzsche actually didn't think it was a threat. Nietzsche was ready to embrace nihilism. He thought it was a great thing. He thought, we have this huge panoply of choices. We are freer than we've ever been. Oh, joyous day, he said. Now we're going to go out and live what he called a gay science. But I think many of my students and many of the people that I meet don't feel this radical kind of freedom they feel it to be sort of unsettling. And the question is, from where are you supposed to understand which things are more meaningful than other things? Which things matter more than other things? Where are you supposed to get the resources to understand what the meaningful differences in your life or in your culture really are? Now that's a problem that I think a lot of people living in our culture recognize. Some people don't recognize it, interestingly. And one of the things that's been interesting in talking about this book is to talk with a variety of people who really don't recognize that as a problem and to think about why they don't recognize it as a problem. But the analysis suggests that whether you're a religious believer or not, this ought to be a problem, or it's a threat that this will be a problem. And the question then is, what's the right way around it? So with that frame, then, the idea of going back to read these works of art that have organized an understanding of what human beings are at their best in the previous epochs in the history of the West is the idea of trying to figure out what in those understandings we can appropriate and bring to ourselves as resources so that we can face this threat of nihilism, so that we can understand on the basis of what things are supposed to matter. So that's the frame for the book. And then in the book we go through, as in the original course, we go through a story about Homer, we go through a story about Aeschylus and the Gospel of John and Dante and all the way up to Melville. And we try to isolate an account of what it is that these epochs, these understandings have that makes them different from us and what we can appropriate from them. So I just want to give you an example of what that might look like. It requires reading these texts in a very careful and weird way, because the natural tendency, I think it's the tendency of any great books course, is to read back into the texts something like the understanding of human existence that we've already got. Usually people will say, on the traditional account of the history of the West, they'll say, well, Homer, he got a little bit of it. It was really interesting because he started to get an understanding of humanity and human excellence, but he was really quite primitive. He didn't have a sense of morality. He didn't have a sense of good versus evil, for instance. He didn't have a lot of the things that we now recognize as things that you ought to have. But our way of reading it is sort of the opposite. We want to go through and look at those things that Homer has that seem foreign to us or bizarre to us or odd to us, and then ask ourselves the question, what understanding of the world and what understanding of ourselves would you have to make sense of these odd kinds of things? Let me give you an example of an odd kind of thing. How many of you have read The Odyssey, by the way? Oh, terrific. Great educated crowd. So you've read The Odyssey. You remember the way the story begins, although it doesn't begin in The Odyssey itself. The story begins with Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, peerless among women, and she's married to King Menelaus, the king of Sparta. This is before The Odyssey, but it's just part of the backstory. And Menelaus and Helen have a small child, And one day they have a house guest, a charming, dashing Trojan prince named Paris, sometimes called Alexander. Paris comes and he's a house guest at their house. And in the story, Aphrodite comes down, this goddess, which ought to sound sort of weird to us to begin with. She comes down, she shines her light on the situation. Everything that matters in that situation is an erotic thing. The erotic is one of the sort of domains of excellence for in the Homeric world. And Aphrodite helps you understand what excellence in the erotic domain is. And here's Helen, who recognizes excellence in the erotic domain in the form of Paris. And sure enough, don't they go off and run away to Troy. Now, it turns out this is, as you recall, a little bit of a problem, and 10 years of Trojan War follow so that they can get Helen back. And in the Odyssey, towards the beginning, in Book 4 in the Odyssey, Helen's already back with Menelaus. So you ought to be asking yourself, although most people, I think, don't ask themselves, how's it going in the Menelaus household there, right? 10 years of war, this woman, she ran off, and now they're back. You ought to be thinking, how are things going? And in Book 4 in the Odyssey, something happens. Telemachus, the son of Odysseus, is grown up. He's now 19 years old, and he decides it's time for him to be a man. He's going to go look for his dad. And so he sails off to Sparta to ask Menelaus, hey, what happened to my dad? Have you seen him? He gets there. They have a big dinner party for him. Big dinner party in the Menelaus and Helen household. And all of the aristocrats of Sparta are there. And Telemachus is there. And they start telling stories about the Trojan War. And, stories of heroism, stories of the great feats that occurred. And Helen says, I've got a great story. So it turns out there I was with Menelaus, and this beautiful guy named Paris came by, right? And boy, Aphrodite shone her light, and everything was erotic, and I ran off with him. And you ought to be asking yourself, boy, was that the right story to be telling in this context, right? But most people, I think, it just slides right by. But she tells this story. And so if you're paying attention, you ought to be asking yourself the question, well, what did people think about this story? I mean, I know what we would think about the story. A, it's not appropriate to tell it in that context. B, if you're telling it, you're condemnable. C, she started the Trojan War. She bears a lot of moral responsibility. All these. Homer doesn't seem to think any of those things. Homer said, first of all, Menelaus says, after she tells her story, an excellent tale, my dear, and most becoming. And if you're reading the book with the question in mind, how do they understand things differently than the way we understand things, then that line ought to jump out at you, right? An excellent tale, my dear, and most becoming. So you're thinking, what on earth has happened? Menelaus thinks it was a great idea for Helen to tell this story about how Aphrodite came down and shone upon her and Paris, and they ran off in this erotic mood. And so the first hypothesis, if you're reading carefully, is to think that the reason he's duped and everyone else at the party seems to be duped is because Helen has been pouring drugs in their drinks, which she has, it turns out. But that turns out not to be why people are okay with this story. Some kind of opium or something to make them be able to endure the pain of these stories. And you can tell that that's not why they're okay with the story, because at the very end of the book, Homer himself says in his own voice that Menelaus lay down to bed, and beside him lay long-robed Helen, peerless among women. So somehow, the fact that she's told this story is some kind of evidence or some kind of indication of the way in which she's peerless. The way in which she is godlike, in fact, is the word that is the Greek word. And now you've got to ask yourself, what on earth are these people thinking? What kind of understanding of human excellence do they have that allows this episode to be an episode that shows us something about what's paradigmatic in human excellence? And so the goal of the chapter on Homer is to try to make out a story about what that is. What is it that they understand about human excellence that's so foreign to us that we can barely even grasp it? And the story goes something like this, although it's still, I think, a very difficult thing to understand. The story is something like this. First of all, it's true that that Homer doesn't seem to hold Helen morally responsible for having done this. He has her say that she regrets that it happened. And this is a little bit covered up in some of the translations, but that's the right way to translate it. Some of the translations say that she experiences remorse, which is not at all the Homeric Greek mood, the mood of remorse. And that's really not what the Greek word says. What she really says, she regrets that things turned out the way they did. And so she feels as though something didn't work out right. But nevertheless, there was something great that happened in that moment when Aphrodite shone her light upon her and Paris, and they together were able to recognize the extraordinary way in which the world can matter at its best in the erotic mood. And so what is that? Well, the suggestion is that there's a kind of phenomenology behind Homer's understanding of what the gods are about. And the phenomenology is this. Sometimes when people are at their best, the activities that they're performing don't feel as if they're generated by some decision of theirs. Rather, they feel as though they're drawn out of them by the situation at hand, by the things that matter most in the situation at hand. So let me give you a different kind of example of this. I think we do have this phenomenon still in the margins of our culture, though we don't pay a lot of attention to it. For instance, you sometimes hear great athletes say, when they're performing at their best, you sometimes hear them say, when I was, the reporter goes up to them afterwards and says, what was it like to make that extraordinary catch? And often you'll hear them say something like, I didn't do it. It wasn't really me. I was just doing what had to be done. Or it felt as though I just felt this thing drawing me over here. Or sometimes you'll hear basketball players say, we think about the case of Bill Bradley when he was a great college basketball player. John McPhee, whom you might know, has an extraordinary early book about Bill Bradley as a great college basketball player. And he says about Bradley that sometimes he'll make a pass which is the only pass that could possibly have been made. And he won't even realize that that was the pass he was making until after the fact. And I think that sometimes it does happen that when we're operating at our best, we have this experience of an activity as being drawn out of us rather than as the activity feeling as though we're the source of the activity. It doesn't feel like there was any decision that was made. It doesn't feel as though there was any choice that we made in order to perform the activity. It simply feels as though the thing that is being done for us or through us. It's being drawn out of us, but we're not the source of that activity. I think that's a legitimate phenomenology. I think that people, if you start to look in your lives, can find that. And we try to argue that it's that Homer thinks is characteristic of human existence at its best. It's that phenomenon. And the reason that he says that in moments like that, a god appeared and shone his or her light on the situation is because he's trying to account for that sense that I wasn't the source of this activity. It was being drawn out of me. And when it was drawn out of me, I was performing in some extraordinary way. Now, that's a very different characterization of what human existence at its best is. It's a characterization that doesn't emphasize things like moral responsibility, precisely because when we're at our best, we're not the source of our own activities. It makes our activities very risky, So, for instance, Helen's activity was very risky. In fact, it turned out not to be the best version of it. But what Homer seems to be applauding in Helen is the fact that she had the openness to recognize that something from outside of her in the situation demanded a certain kind of excellence, and that's what it is to be a human being at your best. So it's a challenge to read Homer in that way. But if you read Homer in that way, the idea is that you can go back and look in your own life and ask yourself the question, is that really a phenomenon that I recognize? And if so, is it the kind of phenomenon that I could appropriate? I mean, we won't have it in the way Homer has it. Presumably, we don't believe that the gods, there are guys up there on Mount Olympus, right? We wouldn't say that Aphrodite did it or Zeus did it. But the phenomenology of it, the way we experience it, might be something that we could aspire to if we thought it was worth aspiring to. And you might think it's worth aspiring to if you're most concerned about the issue, how to confront the threat of nihilism. The threat, that is, that we'll end up living in a culture where nothing matters any more than anything else. Because if you have this openness to what's demanded of you in a certain kind of situation, then it can't but matter. It matters so much that you have to do that thing in that kind of circumstance. Now, there's something very dangerous about this. I want to sort of highlight that. I mean, it was dangerous for Helen. There were a lot of risks that went along with it. But the idea is that those risks, it might be worth taking those risks. You have to ask yourself the question, at any rate, if what you're interested in is living the kind of intense and meaningful lives that Homer and Homer's characters were able to live. And you might be interested in that if you're worried about the threat of this onset of nihilism where nothing seems to mean anything at all. So that's a kind of story that we tell. I think I'm gonna stop at the end of that. But we start with Homer, and we go through it and find very different versions of stories about human excellence in the different epochs. And we just about end the book with Melville's Moby Dick. And what's extraordinary about Melville's Moby Dick, and why it's a nice bookend for the book, is that he literally calls for a return to something like the Homeric Greek gods. Nobody, I haven't read all the vast secondary literature on Melville, but what I have read doesn't seem to recognize this at all. There's for us, very important passage where Melville says that what we can hope to do is lure back the merry May Day gods of old and livingly enshrine them in the now egotistical sky and the now unhaunted hill. If our sky is egotistical, it only has the meanings that we give to it. And if the hills are unhaunted, they're despiritualized. There's nothing meaningful about them anymore. And if we find that a threat, then Melville suggests that what we need to do is lure back these ancient kinds of gods. And I take it that means something like start to become familiar with the phenomenology of human excellence that they manifested. And in that way, we might be able to resist this threat of nihilism. I've left out lots of things, but that's a very brief overview of the book. Maybe longer than you'd hoped, I don't know. Okay, good. Thanks.
We have copies of All Things Shining at the registers. We'll have the signing right here. I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.